The Roman Republic, Unit 2. By the end of this video, you should be able to define the following terms: republic, patrician, plebeian. You should also be able to explain the responsibilities of each of the following groups in the government: the Senate, the consuls, the praetors, the censors, assemblies, tribune, and dictator. Why did the Romans want a republic? After Tarquin the Proud was overthrown, the people didn't want to live under another king or dictator. There had been a series of kings who controlled Rome, the city and the surrounding area, and Tarquin the Proud especially was pretty harsh and cruel, and people were tired of living under those conditions. Instead, they wanted a government that could represent their wants and needs. The word republic literally means public matter, and it makes sense if you think about it, because the laws and the government affect everybody. And it was important to the Romans that if the laws and government were going to have an impact on everyone's lives, that everyone had some say-so in how the government turned out. How was the republic organized in Rome? And this is a little bit different from what you saw in Greece. In Greece, you saw democracy where everybody was able to directly participate. In a republic, participation is based on the right to vote, and people vote for representatives who will then govern and make the laws. All the adult male citizens could vote for people to represent them. And three main groups or branches of the government existed to care for the needs of the people. Those were the Senate, the magistrates, and the assemblies. The Senate was the most powerful and influential branch of the government. It controlled Rome's money and its foreign policy. So it took care of collecting taxes and making sure that the people had access to the goods that they needed, and it handled the relationships that Rome had with other cities and other areas. The Senate also sometimes acted as a court, and in times of crisis, the Senate could appoint a single person to be a dictator, and the dictator had absolute power for up to 6 months so that he could handle the crisis. He had complete control over the military and over the court system. And this actually happens several different times during the history of the Roman Republic. The most famous of the dictators is a man named Cincinnatus, and we'll be talking more about him in class later. The second group are the magistrates, and the magistrates are actually composed of three groups of people: the consuls, the praetors, and the censors. 2 consuls were elected to serve 1-year terms, and the consuls are sort of like the president is the United States today, except there were 2 of them, and they could only serve a year at a time. And once they had served a 1-year term, they couldn't be reelected for a period of 10 years. So you didn't have one person becoming too powerful, because the power was always shared between 2 people, and the length of time that any one person was in office was limited. So the consuls ran the government. Usually one took care of the civil affairs, the legal matters, and just the day-to-day laws that affected people, and the other controlled the military. The consuls also could appoint dictators, and they could veto each other's actions. So if one consul did something that another consul was opposed to, the consul could veto, and that literally means, veto means I forbid. The praetors helped the consuls sort of as advisors. They headed specific courts, and it was the praetors who interpreted the laws if a question arose about what a specific law meant. The censors organized the citizens by wealth, and how much money you had determined how many rights you had, so this was important. They appointed Senate candidates, and they were responsible for just overseeing the moral conduct of all the citizens to make sure that the Roman society was reflective of Roman values of things like virtue and courage. The assemblies were groups of people, and different types of assemblies existed. Some voted on laws and chose officials. Some voted on matters of war and peace. Some served as courts, and some assemblies were convened to elect officials who'd be known as tribunes or tribunes who acted in the public interest. And the tribunes kind of reviewed everything that was going on, and if they felt like a law was being enacted that wasn't going to be helpful to the people, then they wouldn't allow that law to be carried out. The conflict of orders refers to the power struggle that develops between the people who have lots of money and the people who don't have as much money. The patricians were powerful landowners who controlled the government. They were the minority, but they had most of the power and most of the money in Rome. And they were the only people who could serve as judges or who could interpret the laws. So they would make sure that the laws were favorable to their interests. The plebeians were farmers and workers, and they formed the majority of the people in Rome. And they could vote, but they couldn't hold elected office. And many of them didn't even know what the laws were, because at this time the laws weren't written down. So when the patricians interpreted the law, they just would interpret it for their own benefit. And without a written law, the plebeians had a difficult time challenging their power. Now, this conflict continues until the plebeians start to make specific demands and organize protests. And eventually, the plebeians won the right to join the army, to hold government offices. They were allowed to form their own assembly and to have some say-so in who would be elected as a tribune. They also forced the government to write down the laws, and the first version of written Roman law is known as the 12 Tables. We'll also be looking at that in class later. After 342 BC, one consul was always a plebeian, so the plebeians' interests were more fairly represented at the highest levels of government. Over this process and through time, the plebeians gained power and wealth, and it eventually became not such a big deal who was a patrician and who was a plebeian. But since government officials were not paid a salary, most of the power in the government still belonged to the wealthiest people. So, this is how the Roman Republic was set up and functioned. If you need to rewind and rewatch any part of this video, please feel free to do so. Thanks.